He thought it was just a routine patrol in the mountains, but his own people abandoned him to die. The old man lay in the cold all night until something came out of the forest that he will never tell anyone about. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. Walter Krieg had lived long enough to understand that the forest remembered things better than people did. It remembered the storms, the fires, the footsteps of men who thought they could own the land, and the quiet souls who simply tried to serve it. At 72, he had become one of those quiet souls, a living artifact of the national preserve he had patrolled for almost half a century. The cabin he called home stood a mere 1.5 miles from the boundary line, a crooked structure of darkened pine beams and a rusted metal roof that groaned in the winter wind. To anyone else, it would have looked like a forgotten outpost, better suited for demolition than habitation. But Walter preferred it to the tidy modern houses with their screened porches and humming appliances. His place was built by his own hands, a long time ago, back when he still believed that the world rewarded those who did honest work. Each morning he rose before the sun, brewed a black, acrid coffee on his old propane stove, and stepped outside to listen. The forest had a way of speaking to him if he was patient enough. The faint chatter of squirrels, the first tentative calls of birds testing the dawn, the distant groan of shifting branches far up the ridge, all of it formed a language that Walter had learned long before most of his colleagues were even born. He took his time on the porch, letting the steam from the mug rise into the cold air, feeling the familiar ache in his knees and the steady pulse of quiet beneath it all. Life out here was measured not by clocks or deadlines, but by the shifting seasons and the trails of animals that crossed the same ground with a precision modern GPS systems could never rival. Inside the cabin, the walls were decorated with topographical maps tacked up in layers, each one marked with his handwritten notes, the type of details no satellite image could ever show. Old photographs hung beside them, faded shots of rescue crews from the 70s and 80s, when Walter was young and broad-shouldered and laughed easily in front of the camera. There were pictures of wildfire lines he had helped dig, of lost hikers he had found half frozen, of fellow rangers who had since retired, moved away, or died. Sometimes he studied the photos and wondered when the world had shifted enough that he no longer seemed to belong in it. The new rangers at the preserve were polite enough to his face, but Walter saw the way their eyes flicked over him, measuring him against the shiny equipment strapped to their uniforms. They carried tablets with live maps and motion detectors. They wore vests that could alert headquarters automatically if their pulse rate spiked. They boasted about new drone protocols and laughed about how the old-timers once navigated by moss on tree bark or by the curve of a ridge. Walter didn't argue. Let them laugh. The forest didn't care how expensive their boots were or how many apps they could operate. It cared only whether they respected it, and Walter feared that very few of them did. He went out on patrol that morning, the same way he always did, with a practiced pace, a battered notebook tucked in his pocket, and an easy stride that came not from fitness, but familiarity. The preserve was enormous, stretching across ridges, valleys, and old fire-scarred clearings, where young pine had grown in thick and close. As he walked, he touched certain trees, the way one might greet old friends, brushing his fingers along the rough bark, noting where storms had stripped branches, where animals had nested, where the soil had eroded. These things mattered to him. They told him how the land was changing, and whether anything or anyone had disturbed places best left untouched. 3 miles in, something caught his attention. A faint, fresh indentation in the mud that shouldn't have been there. Walter crouched down slowly, letting his joints settle, and stared at the track. A tire mark, not from a truck, no too narrow. A quad. But there was no authorized reason for a quad to be this deep in the woods. This part of the preserve had been closed to motorized vehicles for decades, after a string of erosion issues and a near-fatal accident. The soil had been repaired, new regrowth had been carefully managed, and for 40 years the area had remained untouched by anything heavier than a deer. Walter pressed his palm against the impression. The soil was still soft. Someone had come through late last night, or early that morning, and they had been carrying weight deep enough to suggest cargo strapped to the back. He rose slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved but the wind. He took out his notebook and sketched the mark, noting the width of the tread, the angle of the turn, the depth of pressure. The young rangers teased him for keeping notes by hand, but Walter knew something they didn't. The forest changed constantly, and memory, human memory, was a fragile thing. Paper, at least, didn't lie. Farther up the slope, he found more evidence. A patch of scorched earth where someone had extinguished a fire badly, leaving half-burned scraps of thick commercial plastic. Not the type tourists carried. This plastic was reinforced, meant for shipping. Heavy duty. The kind used to wrap crates. He nudged one of the scraps with his boot, noting the faint chemical smell that lingered despite the rain. On a nearby stone, someone had scraped off residue dark, sticky, like adhesive or something else entirely. Whatever they had opened or repackaged here, they had been in a hurry. He crouched again, his breath forming clouds in the air as he studied the site more closely. There were boot prints, 2 deep ones, not the lightweight impressions of hikers, but wider, thicker, like tactical boots. He traced the direction they led, his mind running through possibilities. The only people with clearance to be this deep in the preserve were rangers, search and rescue volunteers, and occasional wildlife biologists. But none of those groups traveled on quads or carried heavy crates into restricted zones. And none of them burned packaging in the middle of the night. As he followed the faint traces toward the river gulch, a prickle crawled up the back of Walter's neck. He wasn't alone out here, not the way one usually wasn't alone in a forest, surrounded by animals and hidden life. This felt different. Watched. Observed. He turned slowly, eyes narrowed, but saw only trees swaying, their dark silhouettes leaning in the gray morning light. Still, the sensation clung to him like a shadow. Back at the outpost, when Walter mentioned the burned plastic to one of the newer rangers, a broad-shouldered young man named Dalton, the reaction was odd. Dalton's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, before smoothing over into a laugh. He clapped Walter on the shoulder and said, "Probably some stupid camper sneaking where he shouldn't. Kids these days don't read the signs." But his eyes slid away too quickly, and Walter didn't miss the tension in his jaw. Another ranger, Carla, chimed in with a too-bright voice. "You know how it is out there, Walter. People sneak in all the time. Don't overthink it." But her hand hovered near the tablet at her hip, and she kept glancing at the door as though expecting someone else to walk in. Walter said nothing. He simply nodded, made a note in his book, and left. Behind him, he heard a whisper. Quick. Clipped, but not quick enough. "Did he see anything else?" a male voice asked. Then a hushed, "Keep calm." The forest outside felt safer than their office. As the days passed, the signs multiplied. More tire tracks, more burned scraps, more disturbed earth in places where the forest floor should have been pristine, and more side glances from the newcomers who seemed to appear wherever Walter chose to patrol, as if monitoring him. He knew the preserve too well. There were ways through it no modern ranger knew. But someone was learning tracking him, echoing his routes. Walter spent an evening studying his old maps, tracing a route drawn decades earlier. The Fireline Trail, long abandoned, wound through a narrow pass between 2 ridges, emerging near an old access road. It had been shut down after landslides ruined part of the terrain, and since then, Few remembered it existed. Walter remembered, and the tire tracks he had found were leading suspiciously close to where that forgotten trail began. If someone wanted to move contraband through the preserve without being seen, the old fire line would have been perfect. A thought settled uneasily in his mind. Young rangers, too comfortable with patrols they didn't invite him on. Fresh tire tracks, heavy crates, burned packaging, far-off whispers. The pieces clicked together with a grim precision. Someone inside the ranger service was using the preserve as a corridor for trafficking, and someone knew that Walter had begun to notice. He didn't confront anyone. He wasn't reckless. But the next morning, when he found a fresh quad track near a ridge that nobody patrolled, he knew it wasn't coincidence. A scouting pattern, he realized. They weren't just moving through the forest. They were watching him, studying where he went, measuring how much he knew. The call came just after noon, a radio crackle, then a voice. "Walter, we've got possible smoke up north near the quarry basin. Nothing serious, just a visual check. You're closest. Can you take a look?" The voice belonged to Dalton. Too casual, too eager. The quarry basin was one of the most isolated areas of the preserve. No cell signal, weak radio reception, steep cliffs. Walter felt a slow, cold settling in his chest. He hadn't reported any patrol in that direction. How did they know he was close enough to handle it? He drove anyway. Not because he trusted them, but because the forest demanded answers. And he wasn't the type to sit still when something felt wrong. The sky grew darker the farther he went, clouds rolling in from the northwest, as if the weather itself were bracing for something. When he finally reached the basin, he stepped out of the truck, scanning the area. No smoke, no haze, no scent of burning pine. Just the sound of wind rushing over the rocky ledges. He walked to the edge of the old quarry pit, leaning slightly forward to peer down into the drop. The shale crumbled under his boots. Something felt fundamentally, deeply wrong. The air was too still, too expectant. The roar of a quad engine cut through the silence behind him. Walter turned just enough to see the bright beam of headlights. Then the impact hit him hard, a violent shove that sent him staggering backward. The ground dropped away beneath him. He fell. Rocks smashed into his ribs. His leg twisted underneath him with a sickening crack. The world spun in flashes of sky and stone and bone-deep pain. He landed hard on a ledge halfway down the slope, the breath knocked out of him in a sharp, agonizing burst. Above, he heard voices. Dalton's laugh, unmistakable. Another voice. Carla's sharper, controlled. "Is he down?" she asked. A pause. "Good. The storm will take care of the rest." The quad revved. Tires scraped. Then they were gone. Walter lay there, gasping, staring at the jagged lip of the quarry above him, as realization, not just fear, but a profound sense of betrayal settled into his chest. After 40 years of service, after every rescue, every patrol, every hour spent fighting fires and saving lives, this was how they meant to erase him. A quiet death in the woods, an official report blaming age or misstep or heart failure. The sky dimmed as storm clouds slid overhead. Walter gritted his teeth and forced himself upright just enough to drag his body toward a cluster of exposed roots, forming a shallow shelter. The pain in his leg was blinding, a constant pulse of fire pushing through his veins. He used his belt and a branch to brace it, muttering through clenched teeth. The forest around him darkened further as evening crept in. That was when he heard it. At first, it was only the faintest tremor in the ground, so slight he might have dismissed it as lingering dizziness. But then it came again. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Footsteps. Not the scamper of deer or the silent tread of cougar. Not the rustle of wind-shaken branches. These were deep, weighted impacts that seemed to vibrate through the soil itself. Walter's breath caught, and he turned his head toward the sound, though pain shot through his neck like lightning. Beyond the veil of brush, in the faint silver glow of a rising half-moon, something moved. Large. Towering. Its silhouette dwarfed even the tallest man. Shoulders broad as a tree trunk, a shape that did not belong to any creature Walter had known in all his years in the forest. It stood motionless for a long moment, its outline barely shifting except for the subtle rise and fall of breath. Walter blinked, certain he was hallucinating, that the pain, the shock, the cold were crafting illusions. But the figure remained, watching him. The forest held its breath. Even the wind seemed to quiet. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, the shape withdrew into the darkness of the trees. Walter closed his eyes, unable to decide whether fear or awe or exhaustion dominated his thoughts. He clung to the faint warmth radiating from the earth beneath the roots. Above him, thunder rumbled. The first drops of rain fell, cold and sharp. Walter drifted into a half-conscious state. The memory of that enormous silhouette burned into his thoughts like a glowing brand. He could not be sure if what he'd seen was real. All he knew was that something out there, something ancient, something far older than the newcomers who had tried to kill him, had been watching. And the forest, for the first time in many years, felt alive with secrets he was not yet meant to understand. Walter awoke to the cold. It wrapped around him like a second skin, sharp and merciless, slicing through the thin layer of body heat he had managed to preserve beneath the tangle of roots. For a moment he wasn't sure where he was. The world above him was a blur of slate-gray sky and slanted sheets of rain, and every part of his body screamed with reminders of the fall. When he tried to shift his weight, the pain in his legs surged so violently that he had to clamp his jaw shut to keep from groaning aloud. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, fogging in the frigid morning air. It took him several seconds to remember everything: the shove, the headlights, the free fall, the voices laughing above the quarry. He let his head sag back against the dirt, eyes half closed. They had left him here. They had intended to come back, he realized. No one committed a murder by negligence and walked away satisfied. They would return to ensure the job was complete. Walter held that thought with a cold clarity. If he didn't move, he would be dead long before they reached him. Not even from their hands, but from the forest itself. Cold, exhaustion, shock. And yet, the terror of freezing wasn't what made his pulse quicken. It was the memory of those footsteps, the heavy, measured thud that had echoed through the night, just before he drifted into unconsciousness. Something impossibly large had stood between him and the darkness, something he still wasn't sure was real. He tried to sit up, pushing against the roots, and bit back a curse as his injured leg flared white-hot. He could feel the swelling now, stretching his skin tight, and every brush of movement sent a jolt up his spine. He examined the crude splint he had fashioned the night before. It had helped enough to keep the bone from shifting, but the storm had undone most of his careful positioning. He needed a better way to walk, if walking was even possible. Still, the instinct that had carried him through years of rescue operations, through blizzards and fires and treacherous mountain passes, urged him forward. Move. Crawl if you must. Just don't die where they want you to. The first sound that reached him wasn't the storm, but the unmistakable growl of an engine. A quad, its motor snarling through the trees like a predator circling its wounded prey. Walter froze and turned his head, squinting toward the rim of the basin. It was difficult to see through the curtain of rain, but he caught the flash of movement. A dark helmet, the glint of wet metal, the quick shift of weight as someone dismounted. The figure paused, scanning the quarry floor. Even from this distance, Walter recognized the stiff posture of a man expecting to find a body. Dalton. Walter tucked himself tighter beneath the roots, pulling the moss and debris around him as quietly as he could. His heart thudded against his ribs, each beat sending a dull ache through his head. Rain dripped into his eyes, blurring his sight, but he didn't dare wipe it away. Dalton moved to the edge of the drop-off, peering down the slope, one hand resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. His posture was casual, but his eyes were sharp, hunting sharp. Walter pressed his body deeper into the cold hollow of the tree, forcing his breath shallow. If Dalton came down the incline, he wouldn't stand a chance. Even if he somehow managed to crawl, he could barely put weight on his arms without the pain in his ribs sending a shockwave through him. He was a cornered animal now, one wrong sound away from being finished. Dalton took a step closer to the ledge. "Old man?" he called, his voice barely audible above the storm. "You still breathing down there?" He was mocking him, searching for the satisfaction of a response that would confirm Walter's helplessness. Walter remained silent. Seconds stretched. Dalton's gaze lingered a moment longer, then he exhaled with irritation. "Stupid fossil," he muttered. "Should have broken your damn neck." He turned to leave. Before Walter could even release the breath he'd been holding, something shifted in the trees behind Dalton. A branch creaked, not with the light crackle of wind, but with weight. Heavy weight. Dalton paused, half turning his head. His hand hovered near his rifle. The next sound was unlike anything Walter had heard in all his years in the forest. A deep, resonant vibration that seemed to travel not through the air, but through the ground itself, shuddering up through the rock beneath Walter's hands. Dalton stiffened, spinning fully toward the tree line. His voice rose, brittle with uncertainty. "Who's there?" The forest did not answer with words. A shadow moved between the trunks, so large, so broad, that the spaces between the trees seemed too narrow to contain it. Walter watched, breath stolen from his lungs, as the creature stepped into view. Rain slicked over the dark, shaggy hair that coated its massive frame. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, its arms long, the muscles beneath the fur shifting with fluid, deliberate control. Even from behind Dalton, its height was staggering, easily twice that of the ranger. Dalton stumbled backward, fumbling with the rifle strap. Terror flashed across his face, sharp and unguarded. "What the—" The creature crossed the distance faster than Walter could have imagined. One bound, then another, its movement silent except for the faint tremor in the earth. Dalton barely had time to raise the rifle before a massive hand, almost the size of Dalton's entire torso, caught him in the side. The sound was sickening, a thud that echoed off the quarry walls. Dalton flew several yards, hitting the ground in a heap. He didn't move again. The rain muffled everything, but Walter could still hear the creature's breathing, slow, heavy, steady. He realized that he wasn't afraid. His pulse was racing, but it wasn't fear. It was something more complex, a mixture of awe and disbelief, and an odd, instinctual recognition that the forest had just made a decision. It had intervened. But why? The creature turned, its head lifting slightly as if scenting the air. Then, slowly, deliberately, it looked down into the quarry. Its eyes dark, deep-set beneath a heavy brow locked onto Walter's hiding place with unnerving accuracy. Walter did not move. He could not. For a long moment, the forest seemed to hold itself still, every rustle of wind silenced. Then the creature stepped forward, descending the steep rock with effortless balance. Where Walter would have slipped and fallen, the creature moved with the natural grace of something born of the mountains. When it reached the base of the quarry, it stopped mere feet from Walter's makeshift shelter. Up close, the creature was even more astonishing. Its presence filled the narrow basin, radiating heat and a faint, earthy smell like damp stone and pine sap. Walter could see the individual strands of fur clinging together from the rain, the scars running across its arms, evidence of old battles, old seasons survived. It crouched, bringing its massive frame closer to Walter's level. Walter expected a growl, a challenge, some display of dominance. Instead, the creature simply studied him. Its head tilted slightly, its gaze sharp but not predatory. It felt assessing, curious, almost concerned. Walter exhaled slowly, unable to muster the strength to speak. The creature reached to its side, grasped a thick fallen branch, and snapped off the excess with a clean, powerful motion. When it laid the branch beside Walter, the message was unmistakable. A walking staff, a support, a way out. Walter stared at it, overwhelmed by the realization. The creature was helping him. It straightened again, towering over him, and turned its head toward the northwestern ridge. There was nothing but rain and tree shadows in that direction. Yet the creature gestured with a slow sweep of its massive arm, a clear indication of the route Walter had once memorized. The old Fireline Trail. The forgotten path that still existed beneath layers of forest growth. Walter swallowed hard, nodded once. He didn't know whether the creature understood the gesture, but something in its posture seemed to relax. Then, without sound, it stepped back and vanished into the trees, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. For a long time, Walter remained beneath the roots, letting the rain wash over him while he tried to gather strength. He had no idea how long he had before the others realized Dalton hadn't returned. He had no idea if they would search the quarry. But he did know one thing. The forest had given him a chance. A slim, painful, grueling chance, but a chance nonetheless. He dragged himself upright, gripping the branch. It was heavy, solid, and fit his hand, as though it had been carved for him. He braced it beneath his arm and pushed, groaning as his injured leg quivered beneath the strain. Standing felt impossible. Walking felt insane. But he took the first step regardless, then another. The climb out of the quarry was a battle he fought inch by inch. More than once he slipped, crashing to his knees, clutching the branch like a lifeline. The rain made every rock treacherous, every slope slick. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one stabbing his ribs. But he forced himself onward, letting the memory of the creature's dark silhouette guide him, pushing him through each moment he felt his resolve falter. By the time he reached the tree line, he was shaking from exhaustion. But the moment he stepped beneath the sheltering canopy of the pines, he paused. The forest was silent. Not empty. Never empty. But watchful. He could feel it. Somewhere out there, unseen, the creature was moving parallel to him. He couldn't see it, but he sensed its presence with every instinct honed over decades. He didn't dare call out. This wasn't a companionship meant for human language. It was something older. The forgotten Fireline Trail unfurled before him as a faint depression in the earth, swollen with pine needles and last year's leaves. He moved along it, leaning heavily on the branch. Hours blurred into one another. He stumbled, fell, dragged himself upright again. His vision swam, pain threatening to blot out thought. But the narrow corridor of trees guided him onward. By late evening, the storm eased. Snowflakes drifted through the air, melting on his battered skin. Walter's mind floated in a haze, barely tethered to his body. He had long since stopped trying to measure time. All he knew was that forward meant life. Backward meant death. When his legs finally gave out, it was not onto stone or snow, but onto the flattened earth of a cleared path. He blinked, confused, until he recognized the shape of the ranger station ahead, its chimney smoking, its single porch light flickering like a star. He crawled the last yards, fingers clawing at the dirt. He reached the steps, pulled himself up one rung at a time, and collapsed against the door. It opened almost instantly. 2 rangers inside startled backward, then rushed to him with shouts and frantic hands. Their words were quick, panicked, overlapping sounds Walter couldn't fully make sense of. He let his head sag as they lifted him. A strange relief washed over him. Not safety, no. He would never truly trust the ranger service again. But survival. He had made it out. Against the quarry. Against the storm. Against the men who wanted him gone. And against something else. Something he would never name. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital rooms, interviews, and whispered conversations he pretended not to hear. The official report blamed his fall on a misstep in the storm. Dalton and Carla were arrested after evidence surfaced, just enough to tie them to trafficking routes, but not enough to reveal the full scale of their operation. Too many traces had vanished overnight. Too many caches of drugs or supplies had been mysteriously removed before investigators reached them. Walter said nothing about why. He simply nodded when they told him he was lucky. He retired quietly, bought a small house near the foothills, and tried to resume the life he had once found comfort in. But the forest had changed. Or perhaps he had. In the evenings, he sat on his new porch, the staff resting beside him, always within reach. He never polished it, never altered it. The grain of the wood felt warm under his fingers, as though still holding the heat of the creature's hand. Some nights, when the moon hung low and pale over the ridge, he stepped outside and listened. Long after the world had fallen into sleep, the forest breathed in its ancient rhythm. And on those rare nights, those quiet, windless nights when the trees stood perfectly still, Walter heard it. A single step, heavy, measured, somewhere deep in the woods. He never told a soul. He never would. If you liked this story, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Check out the videos on your screen. There's more waiting for you. And share this video with someone who loves a good mystery.